If asked to name a female superhero, Wonder Woman is usually the first that pops into my head. I'm sure this is true for many of you, as she has been around for many decades and was one of the first real female superheroes to make it onto a front page of a comic. However, the second image that follows her is usually not her powers or anything else about her personality, but instead it's usually her big, gravity-defying boobs. Growing up, I knew nothing of Diana's backstory and assumed that she was created just like the rest of female characters in comics. Nothing more than almost naked eye candy for the mostly male fan base that consistently made me feel like an outsider. Now, it wasn't until much more recently that I learned of Diana's unique backstory, both regarding the plot and the man who created her, Charles Moulton. In this video, I'll cover the complicated, sort of feminist story of Wonder Woman, and I'll dive into the life behind the man who created her, in the hopes to better understand her meaning within the early comic setting and now. I hope that this video can begin to answer my question: is Diana a true feminist icon, or is her creation entirely missing the point, and once again just catering to the horny eyes of the male comics fanbase? So, Diana's story begins on Paradise Island, an island made entirely up of Amazonian women. These women escaped captivity after Hercules' cruel entrapment, and created a life of freedom with Aphrodite's help. The only caveat to this life was the promise that no man could enter these women's lives. However, Diana, daughter of the Amazonian queen Hippolyta, falls in love with a man who washes ashore to Paradise Island. Now, although the concept of Paradise Island is a nice change from your typical male superhero backstory, it is definitely not without problems. Instead of supporting an idea of equality and feminism, this island is instead portraying an over-the-top, pseudo-feminist idea of peace only in the absence of men. To love a man in this world is seen as a terrible thing, and these women weren't allowed to have powers and like men. Now, I know how you all probably love to hear a nice old dictionary definition, so Merriam-Webster defines feminism as, quote, belief and advocacy of the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes, expressed especially through organized activity on behalf of women's rights and interests, end quote. Having heard the official definition of feminism, I think the setup of Paradise Island can be taken multiple ways. For one, an island with only women is not equal to the sexes because there's no men. Therefore, it is not adhering to feminist rhetoric. However, if you look at it from the perspective that most places are ruled and governed solely by men, then this is an example of a sort of leveling of the playing field socially and economically, as there is a queen and only women are in positions of power on Paradise Island. Another question arises when reading this first comic. If Wonder Woman's tight, small, exposing costume was created and gifted by her mother, and therefore with the lack of a male gaze, then could this provocative costume almost be seen as a feminist sex symbol? However, outside of the story, the male gaze is still very real and very catered to by comics artists. So I'm not sure if I have a proper answer to this question. So now that we have a basic idea of Diana or Wonder Woman's introduction, I think it would be interesting to kind of start talking about the creator behind Wonder Woman and what his intentions were and what his background was like. Why did he create Wonder Woman? What was going on in his personal life, and does that affect the character you create? William Moulton Marston, otherwise known by his pen name Charles Moulton, was not only the creator of Wonder Woman. In addition, Moulton was a psychologist, writer of a self-help book, a very strange one if I may add, and inventor of an early lie detector test, and also a member of a polyamorous relationship. Now, I named all of these different factors in Marston's life because I do believe that they all have an impact on the work he created and the reasons behind his creation of Wonder Woman. Also, just a heads up, if you hear me using Moulton and Marston interchangeably, that is because he went by a pen name of Moulton, and his middle name, I believe, is Moulton, and his last name, for real, is Marston. So, just to clear that up right now so that it doesn't get too complicated as I continue talking about this man. After a bit of research into Marston's scientific and inventive career, my favorite connection to make between Marston and Diana relates to his invention of an early lie detector test prototype. One could call this machine a detector of truth, or more accurately, a detector of lies. And you know what else is called that? Wonder Woman's lasso of truth, an essential aspect of her powers and character. This hardly seems like a coincidence to me, and is just one example of how Marston's life was intertwined with Diana. Moving on from his inventive career, I'd like to spend a larger portion of this video discussing Moulton's book, Emotions of Normal People. After reading a large portion of this self-help book as research, I began to view certain early Wonder Woman scenes in a very different light. More on what I mean by that in a second, but for now I'll cover some of the bigger points from his book. Although quite murky at points, the main ideas that Marston focused on were the behaviors of dominance, submission, inducement, and compliance. I will mainly focus on how the former two demonstrate the unique opinions of Marston. In his chapters on dominance and submission, Marston uses multiple examples in which he attempts to demonstrate the psychological and physiological enjoyment of humans participating in dominant and submissive behaviors. For example, one paragraph title reads, "Stimulus evoking submission must be stronger than the boy but not too intense," on page 228. Another title on page 231 reads, "Woman's strength seldom felt as superior by adolescent males." And finally, a third title on page 232 reads, "Allied intellectual superiority may evoke submission." The portion on women rarely being seen as dominant can be related directly to Wonder Woman, as she is a rare case of a powerful woman entering a world dominated by men. This is a large part of her appeal as a female hero. The part describing how respectability and intelligence is likely to influence people to submit to women is also necessary to consider, as it can be related to a famous line from the first edition of Wonder Woman, which compares her to gods. This famous line reads, "As lovely as Aphrodite, as wise as Athena, with the speed of Mercury and the strength of Hercules, she is known only as Wonder Woman." There are basically endless comparisons to be made between Marston's book on behavior and his comic books of Wonder Woman, but for now I'll stick to just one more point, that being Marston's opinions on the sexual nature of men and women. One portion reads, "Need for training of male in coitus reservatus," on page 333. This entire portion describes how Marston believes that men should submit and women should be the dominant teachers for men. Quite frankly, when I read this, my jaw dropped. I am not used to reading opinions from men that women should be consistently dominant and men should be consistently submissive, but it was definitely an interesting change. I think no matter who wrote this book, I would have been shocked by the content I was reading, but it's especially shocking when you remember that this is the same man who created Wonder Woman, and it definitely makes you wonder if there are any comparisons that you can make with the kinkiness aspects, the submissive and dominant aspects within Wonder Woman, supposedly a children's comic. Also, the only other time I've ever read something with this many submissive and dominance in one sentence is when I read 50 Shades of Grey in 9th grade. And I think I'm good never hearing those words ever again. Before moving on to relate these parts to Wonder Woman, I would quickly like to touch on how Marston's polyamory may have affected his creation of Wonder Woman. William Moulton Marston, Elizabeth Holloway Marston, and Olivia Byrne were all in a consensual relationship with each other. After Marston passed away, Olivia Byrne and Elizabeth Holloway Marston stayed in a relationship for over 20 years. Both women had 2 children with Marston, and Elizabeth loved Olive so much that she named one of her daughters Olive. At the time that Marston was quite famous, his relationship of polyamory was not something that the public knew about. It has also been said that Marston's great inspiration for creating Diana was his wife Elizabeth Marston, and I also wonder if Olive was an inspiration behind the scenes. Next, I would like to go over some panels from Wonder Woman comics that I see very differently now that I know more about Marston's opinions on submission and dominance. I say this with utter sincerity. I genuinely think it's more difficult to find panels that don't allude to this dominant submissive thing than it is to find ones that do. Just look, they're getting tied up here, and they're getting tied up here, and here Wonder Woman is tying someone up, and here Wonder Woman is getting tied up and she's really enjoying it. And I don't even know where to begin with what's happening here. Or here. Definitely a dominant woman here. And this is also definitely a dominant woman here. And just to give you an idea here, this is probably about 5% of the examples I found while looking around in the Charles Moulton Wonder Woman comics. So, yeah, crazy stuff. Now, let's move on to the last little bit where we conclude and figure out what this means for the general comics industry, the comics setting, and what it means for feminism. In the end, I do feel like there's no easy answer to the question of, is Wonder Woman a feminist? I think there are parts of her story that are really empowering. The idea of being able to basically beat up any man, or tie up any man if that's your thing. And this idea that she is very graceful and also very powerful, well-spoken, intelligent, and beautiful. And her boobs are pretty much out. And although I do think some parts of this sort of attempt at feminism are a little bit overkill, I would say I think that Wonder Woman had a generally good impression on me once I learned a little bit more about her history and the strange man behind it. I think in our culture there's this idea that you can't be everything at once when you're a woman. You're either smart and ugly or beautiful and dumb. You either have your boobs hidden away and you're very established, or your boobs are out and you are on the streets doing Lord knows what. I think realistically you can be all of those, and I actually think that Wonder Woman does a wonderful job at showing you that. You can even be an Amazonian princess for all you know. As a quick closing remark, I would like to add, though, Wonder Woman does still represent a white, privileged binary, and that is something that I will touch on more in another video. But for now, I am going to go sit down and read something that does not involve bondage. Bye!